Classmates, it's time for class. The picker component is a selector component and also a composite component. It includes 5 types of selectors: standard selector, multi-column selector, time selector, date selector, and region selector. Selectors are used very frequently in form components, often seen in area selection, for takeout, express delivery, registration date selection, time selection, etc. Now, let's delve into the study of the standard selector within the picker component. The picker component has an important attribute called mode, which determines the form of the picker component. As mentioned earlier, the picker component has a total of 5 forms of selectors, each corresponding to a different mode attribute value. The type of selector used is determined by the value of the mode attribute. The default value is selector, representing the standard selector. When the mode attribute's value is set to selector, it represents the standard selector. If the mode attribute value is not set, it defaults to the standard selector. The mode value for the multi-column selector is multi-selector. For the time selector is time. For the date selector is date. And for the region selector is region. First, let's look at the standard selector. When the mode attribute value is selector, or when there is no mode attribute, it is a standard selector. In addition to the mode attribute, the picker component has other attributes. One of them is the rank attribute, which is very important, as it determines the data source of the picker component. The data for the picker component generally comes from an array, which can be a standard array, or an array of objects. When the mode value is selector, or multi-selector, the range attribute is effective, meaning that for standard selectors and multi-column selectors, the data source is an array. The range key attribute. When the range attribute is an array of objects, the range key is used to specify the value of the key in the object, which will be displayed in the selector. The value attribute indicates which item from the range array is selected, noting that indexing starts from 0. The selector is a scrolling picker that pops up from the bottom of the screen. When clicking on the scrolling picker, the selected item corresponds to its index, starting from 0 at the top, akin to an array index. The selector type attribute indicates the UI type on a large screen. Usually it's of picker type. When on larger screens, it's displayed with a select style. The picker type refers to a scrolling selector that pops up from the bottom of the screen. On larger screens, the select style means that the scrolling selector pops up at the current position instead. The disabled attribute indicates whether it is disabled. Changes an event handling attribute. When the value changes, the change event is triggered. Within this event, its value is extracted using event detail value. The extracted value represents the index of the selected item. This is an example of a standard selector. In this standard selector, when the mode attribute is set to selector, or not set at all, it functions as a standard selector. It has a rank attribute set to an array. Here, the range is set as an array named array. This array is a standard array containing 4 countries. So, after clicking on the selector, you can choose from these 4 countries. You just need to select one country. These 2 are the same. Setting up a standard selector is very simple. Next, let's take a look at the range key attribute. What does the range key attribute refer to? For example, if the value of the range key attribute is array2, what is the difference compared to the array? In the array, the content to be displayed is stored, whereas in array2, it's not the same. Array2 contains 4 objects. It's an array of objects. Which data from the object array is displayed in the selector depends on that range chi attribute. Here, that range chi is equal to name. At this point, the standard selector displays the values in the name column. If range chi is equal to ID, then the display will show the ID numbers. The standard selector displays the ID column's values. That's the range chi attribute. For an array of objects, the range key is used to specify which field in the object array needs to be displayed in the selector list on the page. Let's take a look at the third attribute, the value attribute. The value attribute specifies which item in the list is initially selected. The default value for that value attribute is 0. In this case, the first one is automatically selected by default. At this moment, the value is 0. Now, this is a standard selector, with that value attribute set to 2. The array is array2, and range chi is set to name. This means that the initial state will display the item at index 2, which is Brazil. For instance, if the value is changed to 1, the default selected item will be USA. If the value is 0, then China will be selected by default. If the value is 3, then the last item, Japan, will be selected. The value attribute sets which value is initially selected and must be a number not exceeding the array index, indicating the index of the intended selection. The select attribute is generally set to picker. The value is a picker style selector, which is the type of selector that pops up from the bottom of the screen with a scrolling interface. If the attribute value is not picker, but select, what kind of situation is that? It's the same display on a mobile phone, but it's different on a tablet. On a tablet, it will show a scrolling selector that pops up at the current position. The last attribute is the change event handler. The handling of the change event mainly occurs when the value changes, triggering the change event. As mentioned earlier, in the change event handling, the value is obtained from event detail value, which represents the index of the selected item in the current array. For instance, in the rank attribute, if the value is still array2 and range chi is name, then it will display China, USA, Brazil, Japan. Its change event is handled by the change epic val method. In the change epic val method, it first outputs the index of the currently selected item to the console, and then assigns it to the index variable. The index variable holds the index value of the selected item. Once it's stored in the index variable, it displays the value of the normal property of the object at the index position in the array to array. This will be shown here. For example, if Brazil is currently selected, the console will display the number 2. Brazil is at index 2 in the array. Similarly, if USA is selected, click the Done button. The console displays 1. If Japan is selected, click the Done button. The console displays 3. That's the index of the selected item in this array. Assign it to the index variable. Here, retrieve the property value corresponding to the index item in this object array, and display it at the current position. Let's look at another example, and examine the handling of that change event. In this example, the rank attribute is set to the range array. The range array looks like this. Each object has 2 properties, ID and title, representing the IDs and titles of 4 countries. The range chi attribute is set to title, so it displays the title of the country. The value attribute value is index, and the change event handling method is bind picker change. Let's take a look at the bind picker change method. It does the same thing. The bind picker change method also retrieves the value of event detail value, which is the index of the currently selected item in the array, and stores it in the index variable. It still displays the title property of the object at the index position of the rank object array. For instance, if Brazil is selected, will display 2. If USA is selected, the console displays 1. And if Japan is selected, the console displays 3. This is how that change event is handled. In this lesson, we learned about standard selectors. Mastering standard selectors not only allows us to design beautiful interfaces, but also takes into account performance, accessibility, and other aspects, enhancing the overall quality of the project. That's it for this lesson. Thank you, everyone.